This is the true story of Megan Newton, a driven and talented 18-year-old girl, a young woman that had already achieved so much and was ready to take on the world. But then, after entering her apartment one night, she would never walk out. So, what happened to Megan? Viewer discretion is advised for this educational documentary. Megan Newton was a shining star in her community in Stoke-on-Trent in the West Midlands. At just 18 years old, she had already accomplished more than many in her lifetime. With an unwavering dedication to academics, sport and the community as a whole, she was also a well-rounded football player who stood out from the crowd. Her coach at Stoke Town Ladies said, "She loved life and she was a ball of energy, a force to be reckoned with." And a force she was. Her dreams were big, but she was determined to make them a reality. With her ambitious spirit and love for football, she dreamed about securing a scholarship to go and study in the United States. Her dream was to be the first of her family to go to university, and she intended to pursue a career in sports therapy. She had a genuine hunger for football coaching. She coached the Norton Wanderers under-7 side, and she was getting ready to undertake a Football Association coaching course. By all accounts, it seemed that Megan was well on her way to achieving her goals and ambitions. She was on course to leave a lasting impression on the world. But everything would change on the 19th of April 2019. It was a Friday, but not just a normal Friday. It was the start of the Easter weekend, and for 18-year-old Megan and her friends, that meant a bank holiday in the UK. Bank holidays in the UK are an excuse to go out with your friends and let your hair down, and this is exactly what Megan had every intention to do. Megan worked her shift at a local fish and chip shop in Trent Vale and finished just after 10 PM, but the late shift wasn't about to stop her night out. She headed straight home to freshen up and change into something more clubbing appropriate. She met up with her friends at around 11:30 PM, and as is the case with people of this age, for them, the night was still young, and the excitement was palpable. Megan and her friends hit the town first, stopping at a local bar to kick off the festivities. Glasses clinked and laughter filled the air as they toasted to the start of the Easter weekend. But the real festivities were just beginning. As the night went on and the party continued, the group made their way to a popular nightclub where they danced the night away. Megan was in high spirits, giggling, dancing, and proudly showing off her new tattoo. She was basking in the moment and living life to the fullest. The party eventually came to a halt at 2:20 AM. Not by choice, the clubs were all closing. Megan said goodbye to her friends and made her way to a nearby taxi rank so that she could catch a cab back home. Little did she know that this seemingly routine journey home would become a fateful turning point in her life. When Megan got to the taxi rank, there was already a long queue as other partygoers all seemed to have the same idea as her. Everyone just wanted to get home. Knowing that her wait would be a long one, she braced herself for a tedious wait while standing in line. Waiting for a ride, Megan ran into Joseph Trevor, an old friend from school. Well, friend was a stretch, more like acquaintance. They saw each other out and about on nights out and would say hello. Their shared love for football often sparked conversation between the two. Joe, as he was more commonly known, also seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. He was a semi-professional footballer. He was the son of 2 police officers, and although his parents were strict, he had a normal upbringing and grew up in one of the most affluent parts of Stoke-on-Trent. He was in the process of studying for his A-levels, and he had already secured a scholarship to study at an American university. But it seems that, despite his promising future, his path was far from certain. Unlike Megan, he appeared to lack the drive and determination needed to succeed. He wasn't really willing to make the sacrifices needed to reach the very top. Despite his relatively comfortable life, he was prone to getting into trouble at school, and his illicit substance use was a constant source of concern. In fact, while standing in line with Megan that evening, he told her of the disastrous night that he'd had. He said that he was at the same nightclub as Megan and her friends, but he had been focusing on drinking excessively and indulging in illicit substances. It was at this nightclub that a bouncer caught him with a bag of ketamine, and this then resulted in a run-in with the police. Joe, however, was let off with a warning. He told Megan the last thing he wanted was to face his police officer parents at home while still under the influence. He told Megan that he was already in trouble with the police, and he didn't want to go home intoxicated and get into any more trouble with his parents. Desperate for a place to stay until he sobered up, Megan handed him her phone so that he could call some friends and find someone to help him out. However, none of his friends answered his calls. It seemed that Joe was now in a bit of a pickle. In a moment of compassion, she offered her couch as a refuge for the night, and Joe gratefully accepted. Little did she know that this act of kindness would spark a chain of events that would change everything. While in a cab on their way home, Joe actually received a text from his dad asking when he'd be returning home. At this point, Joe lied and said that he was staying over at a male friend's house. Megan and Joe are then seen walking on the side of the road on their way back to her flat. They eventually arrive at her apartment at around 4 a.m. Nothing seems to be out of the ordinary. They are quite jovial as Megan tries to unlock her front door. Joseph can be seen standing behind her. He takes a quick glance to his left and to his right, almost as though he was scouting his surroundings, checking to see if anyone spotted him arriving home with Megan. Was this just a normal reaction, or was it an indication of the darkness that lay ahead? A few moments later, the door is unlocked and Megan enters her apartment, with Joe following closely behind. This is the last time that Megan is seen alive. On the morning of the 20th of April 2020, another resident at Megan's apartment building made a gruesome discovery. Whilst taking out the trash, they found Megan's apartment key and fob, stained with a reddy brown substance. In their building, you couldn't get in or out without a fob. If Megan's fob was in the trash, where was she? Alarmed by the sight, they raced to Megan's door. They pounded at it with urgency, desperate for a response. When the neighbours heard nothing back, they used the stained keys to gain access to the flat. There they were greeted with an even more gruesome discovery. The apartment was eerily quiet. In Megan's bedroom, they were confronted with an horrific image. She lay lifeless and unclothed on her bed. The multiple visible wounds suggested this wasn't an accident. Someone had ended the life of Megan Newton. When police arrived to investigate, they noted that there were no signs of forced entry. Megan must have known the attacker. She would have had to have let them in herself. And once she did, she was throttled, intimately violated, and jabbed a total of 9 times in her neck and back with a sharp implement from her own kitchen. Police immediately turned to the CCTV footage from her building. At first, it appears to be just a young couple coming home after a night of fun, but what lies beneath the surface is shrouded in darkness and deceit. As she fumbles her key and gleefully makes her way into her flat, she's closely followed by Joseph Trevor. Their mood appears to be happy and nothing is out of the ordinary. The two are seen entering the apartment shortly after 4 a.m. And then, less than 90 minutes later, Joseph is seen leaving the flat again. But this time, he's alone. His demeanour is calm and he appears relaxed. He's then seen exiting her apartment building and strolling through the parking lot. He goes to the nearby bins where he discards Megan's apartment key before leaving her complex. Footage from a nearby camera captures Joseph as he's walking down the street. At some point, he turns his hand to look at it, and the camera captures him with blood on his hand. Joseph here was quite literally caught red-handed. Joseph Trevor walked for another 15 minutes towards a bridge over the A500. This is a major dual carriageway in Stoke. Here he sits down at the edge of the bridge with his feet hanging over the road below. We can only guess the thoughts running through his head at this time. Was he reliving the last hour? Was he thinking about what had occurred within those four walls? Was he thinking about how he had thrown his scholarship, his life, away? He wasn't there long before catching the attention of a driver passing by. Alerted by the sight, the driver notified the authorities, who immediately rushed to the scene. The police apprehended Joseph and took him to the Heartlands Hospital to evaluate his mental state. They were determined to keep him from harm. After concluding that he was not a danger to himself, they called his father to take him home. Little did they know, they were releasing a cold-blooded killer. After reviewing the CCTV footage, police rushed to Joseph's home and brought him in for questioning. The evidence was already, frankly, damning. They just needed a confession. But that wasn't what they got. Joseph admitted to the police that he had been with Megan the previous evening, and he told them that they were consensually intimate before his memory went blank. He said that he didn't remember what happened after their relations, but that he was 100% certain that he hadn't attacked Megan. He wasn't a killer, he knew that much, but CCTV suggested otherwise. The police arrested Joseph Trevor for the killing of Megan Newton on the same day. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, Joseph Trevor remained steadfast in his claim of innocence. He intended to plead not guilty, forcing Megan's grieving parents to endure a full trial and prolong their suffering. After 10 months of gathering evidence, the state was ready to bring him to trial. They believed that he was responsible for the heinous crime involving Megan. Before proceedings could even begin, Joseph stood up in court. He shocked everyone in the room by declaring his guilt. The once defiant defendant now stood before the court ready to tell his version of events. He told the court that when he was 15 years old, he was accused of violating a 14-year-old girl. There were no charges and the matter never even went to trial, but the stigma followed him for years. He was bullied at school, nicknamed and Rolf Harris. By the way, just Google it at your discretion if you're not from the UK. And on the night of the crime, he ran into Megan in a taxi rank. The two had a brief conversation and Megan apologized to him. She told him that she was the one responsible for spreading these rumors around the school. He said that when Megan admitted this to him, it had brought up old demons. And it was ultimately this admission that drove him to murder. The prosecution, on the other hand, didn't believe a word of Joseph's version of events. There was nothing in Megan's character that suggested she would start those rumors. She had always been nice to him. The prosecution argued he wasn't triggered by a confession, but instead by rejection. They argued that when Megan invited Joe back to her place, it was purely platonic. She was being nice and he was in a sticky situation. He was having a bad night and he had nowhere else to go. Joseph's motives for going back to her place were for intimate relations, and he most likely tried to come onto her when they got back to her flat. When she rejected him, Joseph flew into a fit of rage. Joseph was used to getting what he wanted, but he couldn't have Megan. When she said no, he ended up throttling her for 15 to 30 seconds, and he ultimately jabbed at her with a sharp implement. This case was surely black and white. The judge agreed. He stated, "The attack on her was driven and motivated by your serious and violent sexual conduct. You violated her. You went on to strangle her. You went on to arm yourself with an implement from the kitchen area and jabbed her no less than 9 times. There was no question of whether or not he was guilty, only of what his punishment would be. Joseph Trevor was sentenced to a minimum of 21 years and 65 days in jail before he could then be considered for parole. This means that he may be back out on the streets by the time he turns 40, a fact that Megan's parents find difficult to digest. No amount of time could ever bring their loving daughter back, but they believe the light sentence Trevor got is much too lenient for the heinous crime that he committed. On Thursday, January the 3rd, 2019, Savannah Spurlock, aged 22, planned to go out that night with a small group of friends. It would be her first night out in months after giving birth to twin sons just a few weeks prior. Having twins was understandably overwhelming, so their father looked after them to relieve some of the pressure from Savannah. Additionally to the twins, she also had two other boys, who were then aged 4 and 2. Ellen Spurlock, Savannah's mother, volunteered to watch the boys while Savannah was enjoying her first night of freedom in close to a year. Savannah, Ellen and the kids lived in Lexington, Kentucky. Savannah's plans to go out with friends were welcomed by Ellen because she felt her daughter needed a break. She was happy to help make the night happen. Mother Ellen lent her car to Savannah for the night. Excited for a night of fun and letting her hair down, she drove the car to one friend's house. There, she left the car. The three friends then drove to a bar, confusingly called the other bar in Lexington, in one of the friends' cars. After enjoying some drinks together, one of the friends left early in the night, but Savannah and her remaining friend kept the night going. However, as can often happen on a night out, the two friends then had an argument. The two then split up, the friend went home, but Savannah stayed out alone in the bar. A few hours later, at around 2:30 AM, Savannah too departed the bar. Soon after, she FaceTimed Mother Ellen to let her know she would return later that morning. Following the call, Ellen went to sleep, believing her daughter would return home shortly. Following that call, Ellen went to sleep, believing that her daughter would return home shortly. When Ellen awoke the next morning, she came to the heart-stopping realization that her beloved daughter never arrived home. Savannah didn't often go on nights out and was very family conscious. Ellen knew that Savannah would not likely go AWOL and leave her boys without their mother for a long period of time of her own free will. Panic now rising, she tried to call her, but her phone was either off or her battery was dead.
We do not have her cell phone. So we would like to have the cell phone. We're looking for her and the cell phone. But we know for sure that the cell phone went out of service around 8:30 to 8:45 that morning. How it went out of service, we don't know. But we know that it did, and it hasn't been turned back on.
Later that day, Ellen could no longer sit and wait. She had to take action. She reported her daughter missing.
Savannah's about 5 foot tall. She's 140 pounds. She had kind of reddish brown auburn hair. She has some tattoos, a rose on her shoulder, a Bible verse, I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. And on her back, she has a tattoo that says, I am her daughter.
Police began their investigation. The Lexington bar security footage was obtained by the police after speaking with Savannah's friends. This was the last confirmed sighting of her at this time. On this CCTV footage, Savannah, along with 3 men, were seen leaving the bar. None of the men that she left with were previously known to her, according to information from her friends. The friends also said that they hadn't seen or spoken to the men in the bar either. When her daughter FaceTimed her, Ellen claimed that she appeared to be fine and unconcerned. Savannah was in a car when Ellen spoke with her and she saw a man behind the wheel. The man wasn't someone that Ellen recognised. The fact that she had seen her daughter being driven by a man she didn't know now brought feelings of dread. Although Ellen claimed that she couldn't see them very well, she said that there were 1 or 2 other people in the back of the car. She said they were hollering and talking over each other, so she couldn't really hear what was going on. Ellen responded that Savannah did not appear disturbed and that nothing appeared unusual when asked by the police as to whether she appeared distressed. Savannah assured her of her safety. "I will be home later this morning, I promise." Police started searching for the males that Savannah was seen with in the video. Through their investigation, they were able to identify both the men and the vehicle that Savannah was riding in. They confirmed that Savannah was not familiar with the men prior to this night, but that the 3 men did all know each other. They were close friends. Police believed that 2 of the males were in the car with Savannah, while the 3rd followed them in a different vehicle. Police then created a timeline of the night. Savannah indeed left the other bar with the 3 men. The 4 of them then travelled to a property owned by one of the men. The man that owned the house was named David Sparks. He was 23 years old. They travelled 40 miles or so from Lexington to Garrett County. When they arrived in Garrett County, police could not yet determine whether Savannah stayed there or moved to yet another location. David Sparks and the other two males were taken in for questioning by the police. David acknowledged that that evening the three of them did indeed exit the bar with Savannah. All four of them then travelled to Garrett County. However, the two other men eventually left, leaving David and Savannah alone.
For the first time, we were able to watch police interviews with the two men who were with them that night. They all ended up at Sparks' Garrett County home. They said Spurlock was alive when they left the house.
And he hurt that girl?
Yeah.
What'd he tell you?
Yeah, I feel like he eventually would.
Have you asked him that yet?
Yeah. I asked him. He been adamant that he don't know nothing. That's why I asked him, like, bro, you need to be 100% on point, because this is with us all. But I told him at the end of the day, bro, like, we left at your house, bro. You know what I'm saying? Me and left. So whatever happened after that, you need to go ahead, man, up and say what need to be said.
David, however, denied that anything happened between the two of them. He told authorities that he used the couch as a bed, so that Savannah could use the actual bed. David said he couldn't remember the time, but he recalled Savannah waking up at some point and asking for the location of the house that they were in. He claims that he told her and then went back to sleep. She had left by the time he woke up later that morning at around noon. He speculated that she may have got in touch with someone and given them the address so that they could take her home to her family.
At that point, her friend had left her. She was upset and she trusted that they were good people.
Cops also released these images of Savannah standing outside with no coat.
That made me sick to my stomach. You can just look at her face and tell that is not Savannah. Something's wrong.
Do you think it's credible that she would have walked out the front door and into the night?
I do not believe her just walking out that door. She would have called one of us. She would have called her mom. She would have called someone to come get her. I hope that she is being held somewhere and she is still fighting for her babies and her family and her friends.
Kayla Hamblin is part of Savannah's inner circle. She says the night the mom of four vanished, Savannah was with a different friend for her first girls' night out.
I do think she was going through a tough time because she did just have the two twin boys. And at the time, she wasn't aware that she was having twins. She thought she was only having one baby. People can use that to say that she might have wanted to run away from her life, but she would never.
Kayla hopes Savannah will be found soon and has this emotional message for her best friend.
That I love you and I will never give up on finding you.
The Garrett County farm property owned by his parents was searched by police after obtaining a search warrant, but Savannah was nowhere to be found. Therefore, none of the men were detained or given any sort of legal notice.
Somebody out there, please, they know something. Put this nightmare to rest so we get some kind of closure.
Search teams have scoured hundreds of acres and discovered a piece of fabric the exact same color as the skirt Savannah was wearing the night she disappeared.
In July 2019, 6 months after the incident, David's father called the police to report that a bad smell was emanating from a location on his property. When the police arrived at the site, they discovered a small section of earth that had been previously disturbed. The earth covered a hole that was only 19 inches in depth. Under a rug, shrouded by trash bags, lay Savannah, clothing removed, feet taped together.
How was she missed? There she was the whole time.
That's something that I ask myself actually still when I think about Savannah is how did we not find her? How did I not find her? I actually stood on the strawberry patch, like where it was.
As part of the initial investigation by Richmond Police Department, the 3 men last seen with Savannah Spurlock were identified and interviewed, one of which was David Sparks. The investigation indicates that Savannah Spurlock was seen at the residence of David Sparks during the morning hours of January the 5th. As a result of the ongoing investigation, David Sparks, 23 years old of Lancaster, Kentucky, was arrested early this morning in connection to the recovery of Savannah Spurlock's body. About 4 months ago, I believe in February, law enforcement responded to the location on Fall Lick Road in Garrett County, at which time a search was done. The property is owned by some of Mr. Sparks' family members. I don't believe that there's any indication that she was placed there recently. I think that the odor is what kind of indicated, and that's what the information that we received yesterday, that's what led us there.
David was now detained by the police. However, he continued to plead his innocence. There were no signs that Savannah's body had been relocated, so it is unclear why she wasn't discovered when the area was examined after she was originally reported missing. The prosecution's case was based on the facts that Savannah was last seen with David, that she returned to the family-owned property, and that her body was also discovered there. The rug that was found covering Savannah was also identified by police as one from David's bedroom. A rug was found in his bedroom when it was checked a few days after Savannah was reported missing, but it was later discovered that this rug was a replacement. The investigation revealed that he got in touch with his sister on January the 5th to inquire about the rug's purchase since he desired a new one. Later that day, he was captured on camera in Walmart paying for a rug. Additional evidence embroiled him further. The closet door of his bedroom was covered in Savannah's blood. However, despite the evidence, the prosecution was unable to describe how Savannah passed, or what else occurred to her in the early hours of January the 4th. Therefore, they began discussions with David about a potential plea deal, since they thought that they wouldn't be able to prove any aggravating circumstances. David agreed to enter a guilty plea to murder and tampering with physical evidence. The plea deal detailed what occurred, but did not mention how Savannah passed. It read, "During the early hours of January the 4th, 2019, at 118 Price Court in Garrett County, Kentucky, the defendant, acting alone, intentionally caused the death of Savannah Spurlock. After doing so, he bound her legs and wrapped her in plastic bags. He later transported her body and buried her in the yard behind the residence. He did so with the intent to elude apprehension for the crime." David avoided a possible life sentence by entering this guilty plea. Due to COVID-19, the sentencing was broadcast live from the Lincoln County Jail on Zoom. Throughout the sentencing session, he remained silent.
You agreed at that time to plead guilty to the charges of murder, tampering with physical evidence, and abuse of a corpse. Recommendation of the Commonwealth was 50 years on the murder, 5 years on the tampering, 12 months on the abuse of the corpse. All concurrent for a total of 50 years. I will accept that recommendation and impose that sentence.
He will be qualified for parole after completing a 20-year sentence.
When the judge sentenced David Sparks to 50 years in prison, Savannah Spurlock's family had to watch it on a laptop.
I think he got off real easy and real cushy being behind a computer screen, behind a mask, not having to face the people he devastated in person.
Andy Sims, the Commonwealth's attorney, outlined their decision to accept a plea offer as opposed to proceeding with the trial and asking for a life sentence. He said, "We did not have proof beyond a reasonable doubt for any aggravating circumstances. So, because we didn't have any aggravators, we couldn't seek the 3 highest penalties in the Commonwealth." The 2 other males who were captured on camera leaving the bar that evening with Savannah and David were not charged in connection with Savannah's passing. What do you believe happened that night? Do you think this punishment fits the crime? Let me know down in the comments. This is the true story of Libby Squire, a kind and determined young woman, someone that had fought hard to build a new life for herself and was finally settling into truly being her. But after a night out that never even got started, a plethora of witnesses and CCTV, how exactly did Libby simply vanish? Libby Squire was born on the 1st of January 1998. She grew up in a small village in Buckinghamshire in England. She was a doting big sister to her brother and 2 sisters, and she was very close to her mother Lisa and father Russell. The small town girl was wickedly funny, witty, and known for her kind nature. She had always been intelligent and pushed herself hard to do well in school, but she also held herself to an impossibly high standard. Her mental health soon started to suffer, and before she knew what was happening, she was battling an eating disorder, and then her grades started slipping too. However, she continued to push through and persevere to get her A-levels. She then took a gap year and went traveling in Paris. By the time she got back, she was more than ready to move into the next phase of her life, university. Her mother Lisa was worried about her daughter being so far away. She did not want her mental health to start suffering again, but Libby knew she was ready for a fresh start at the University of Hull. She was going to study philosophy and was in a great place. Libby was ready for her real life to begin. On January 31st, 2019, Libby, now 21, and her friends were getting ready to paint the town red. They were halfway through their second year at university, and they were celebrating their results from their Christmas assessments. At around 8:30 p.m, Libby left her student accommodation on Wellesley Avenue. She headed with a large group of friends to another student house nearby. A lot of students in the area were going out, and the plan was to pre-drink, play some games, catch up, and then head to the Welly. The Welly was the go-to spot for students in Hull, and this night was no different. At around 10 p.m, she sent her boyfriend Connor a text message. She said goodnight as they were heading out and she was leaving her phone at home. By this point, the pre-drinks were flowing and everyone was in high spirits. The group reached the Welly at around 11:20 p.m, but not everyone made it inside. Libby was drunk. She was actually so drunk that she was struggling to walk, talk, or stand. The security team on the door turned her away, saying she had already had too much to drink. 10 minutes later, her friends put her into a taxi, gave the driver money, and told him to take her back home. They watched as a taxi drove off, knowing their friend was much safer calling it a night before she put herself in danger. Little did they know that this was only the start of Libby Squire's night. Just before 3 a.m, Libby's friends were winding down for the night. After making it home, one of them sent a text message to Libby's housemate to see how she was. They expected to hear that she was hugging the toilet or passed out in bed, but to their alarm, they said Libby had not come home. They hadn't seen or heard from her since she left in a taxi that night. Was she not with you? The housemate asked. Panic started to set in as Libby's friends started to phone around. No one had heard from her. Panic turned to terror when they found her house keys in the garden. Not only was Libby very drunk, it was also bitterly cold outside and snow was covering parts of the road. They knew this just wasn't safe. The police were called and were concerned. They launched an investigation immediately. With Libby's history of mental health issues, they wondered whether this was a cry for help. Her friends and family knew they had to consider every possibility, but this one was highly unlikely. She had been in the best of spirits, she loved her housemates, and had just received great marks and feedback from her exams over Christmas. Within just a few hours, the media was running with the story. Libby was pushed to the forefront of everybody's minds. The police were able to quickly track down the taxi driver that took her home. The driver claimed that he had dropped her at Wellesley Avenue, and when he glanced back, he saw her walking towards her front door. We know now that Libby never went inside, and fortunately CCTV covered the streets. It wasn't hard to track her movements after getting out of the taxi. She was just a stone's throw from her front door. Cameras showed Libby walking along the roadside at 11:37 p.m. She was visibly intoxicated. By 11:40 p.m, she was lying in the snow. Two passers-by stopped to try and help her. They were concerned about the crying young woman laying on the ground. They described her as agitated, incoherent, and when she snapped at the pair that she didn't want any help, they felt that there was nothing that they could do. A group of students then saw her outside their house. They invited her in to check that she was okay, but she instead carried on walking, seemingly aimlessly. And authorities said that given how cold it was early that morning, she could well have been suffering from the early side effects of hypothermia. Libby's best friend Lauren said, "When people go out and they drink, sometimes you lose your phone, or you can't get home quite as easily. But she's always made sure that she's found a phone, or anyone she can contact to make sure someone knows that she's safe, regardless of what had happened. So to not hear anything from her at all is completely not like her." However, Libby was then spotted on CCTV 45 minutes later at the junction with Hayworth Street. A male driver reportedly saw her sitting on a bench and got out to ask if she was okay. She said she was, and he drove away. What happened next remained a mystery. In the days following Libby's disappearance, police said that they were still treating it as a missing persons inquiry. Behind the scenes, detectives began looking at it as an abduction. Police asked residents to check their gardens, sheds, and outbuildings. This was just in case she may have taken shelter there. Door-to-door inquiries were being carried out and bins and drains were being searched. On the road where Libby lived, the search effort was just as thorough. Police officers were hoping to find even the smallest clue to piece together her last known movements. Just as they were beginning to lose hope, police received their first big tip. A resident that lived near Oak Road playing fields said he heard a woman screaming at around midnight. He said that the noise he heard was coming from around the wooded area. It was so loud that it woke him up, and he knew the time was exact because he had checked his phone. He looked out of his window to see a man hurrying towards a car. Using this time frame, police went back and searched through the cameras again, but this time working in reverse order. This narrowed down the search. On the footage, they noticed a silver Vauxhall Astra had been circulating the area for hours before Libby was last seen. It was just driving around and around, seemingly aimless. But just before midnight, this car was seen pulling in at the end of the road, close to where Libby was walking. A person stepped out and crossed the road quickly to follow her. The person then crossed back over and started walking along the other side of the road. It appeared that whoever it was had crossed the road to see who, if anyone, Libby was walking with and gauge what the situation was. They stopped for a minute before crossing back over the road and talking to Libby. 5 minutes passed when the pair were seen walking together, but now in the opposite direction that Libby had been heading in. Libby was on the pavement and the driver was sitting in the car. Authorities saw a few more headlights come and go, but they believed whoever the driver was waiting for the coast to be clear before continuing on. At 12:08 AM, Libby got inside of whoever's vehicle it was and the car drove off. Her watch was later found in that exact area. The police theorized that there was likely a point where either the driver physically tried to coax her in, or maybe even grabbed her arm to pull her into the car. They now had a description of the car, and going off of what the resident had said, a time frame and a potential location for where the car had ended up with Libby. Sure enough, the car was tracked as it pulled into the Oak Road's playing fields. 10 minutes passed, and this was around the time the residents heard the screams. The car lights then came back on, and the car exited the fields and headed back out onto the streets. 2 women then also came forward with a separate complaint. A complaint that would ultimately turn into a huge lead. They reported that at around 3 AM, a man had stepped out in front of them on the streets and then started intimately touching himself. They were horrified, but he didn't seem bothered at all, relishing just how uncomfortable he had made them. Using this time, location, and description, they found the man in question. Everything matched up, and it was the same man in the same car. They now had a clear image of their person of interest. Following his movements in the hours before and days afterwards, they got a hit on the car's number plate. On February the 6th, the police arrested a 24-year-old man in connection with Libby's disappearance. The man was a married father of 2. His name, Pavel Relevich. He worked as a butcher and moved to the UK from Poland as a teenager. Neighbours described Pavel as a hard-working man who enjoyed the gym, baking and long walks with his young family. He was always friendly, polite and smiling. However, little did anyone know that Pavel would soon rack up a string of crimes. The police had caught a very dangerous individual. Along with being arrested for the suspicion of Libby's abduction, he was also arrested for offences. Pavel lived close to where Libby was last seen and to the fields where the screams had come from. After taking a sample of his DNA, it turned out that he was linked to several other crimes, going back almost 2 years. For a long time, Pavel had been breaking into people's homes, peering through windows and following women on the streets. Although fingerprints were often lifted and DNA samples were taken from the houses, Pavel had no criminal record and a match to him was never made. But now they had their man. The police conducted a thorough search of his house and vehicle. Whilst his house turned up nothing, inside his vehicle was a different story. There was dirty underwear, adult toys, used prophylactics, photographs of women clearly taken without their permission, along with various other items that had been stolen from houses. When he was asked about Libby, he denied ever seeing her in his life. But when a CCTV was shown to him, he changed his story, saying he had picked her up that night to help her, calling himself a good Samaritan and offering to take her home. He said he drove her to Oak Fields and then drove off. This wasn't an admission of a crime, but it was enough to place him at the scene. But unfortunately, this still wasn't enough to charge him. The case had come to a standstill. 7 weeks after Libby had gone missing, a fisherman in the Humber estuary found a badly decomposing body floating on the water. Around the neck was a little necklace with the letter L on it. It was Libby. Her condition was so bad that it was not possible to determine the cause of death. It was unconfirmed whether she was already dead when she went into the water or not. The pathologist said that she could have died from asphyxiation or drowning, but they could not be certain. Testing confirmed that Libby had also been violated before being killed. Everyone was devastated. Mother Lisa was even more upset when she found out where Libby had been found. Libby had a huge fear of water and wasn't a strong swimmer. Wondering whether she was alive or not when she went into the river only added to the heartbreak. Police continued to build their case against Pavel. They searched through thousands of hours of footage to solidify his movements on the night that Libby got into his car. CCTV had shown him driving back out to the same location at around 2:30 AM in the morning, just 2 hours after he was initially there with Libby. He stayed for a few minutes before heading back into town, which is where he exposed himself to the women on the streets. This was the final piece that they needed. He would have had no reason to go back there unless he was concealing things and covering up evidence. More tests also came back after months of waiting. They showed that Pavel's DNA was on and inside Libby's body. He then changed his story, saying that Libby had essentially thrown herself at him, and the pair had had consensual relations in the field before he left her there. But it was clear that this was not the truth. Detectives finally had enough to charge him. In October 2019, Pavel Relovich was charged with the assault and murder of Libby Squire. As he was read the charges in the police car via a translator, he started to laugh, appearing completely unfazed.
I must say that you are under arrest for the murder and rape of Libby Squire in Hull on Friday the 1st of February 2019.
Muszę pana poinformować, że zostaje pan oskarżony w tej chwili za zabójstwo i zgwałcenie Libby Squire dnia 1 lutego 2019 roku w Hull. It's impossible.
To jest ja nic nie zrobiłem, to jest 100%.
What I mean is I haven't done anything. This is 100% sure. I would have never killed a human being.
He pleaded not guilty, maintaining his story of a casual, consensual hookup. After delays due to the pandemic, the trial finally began in January of 2021. The prosecution put forward a damning case. They argued that Pavel was a highly dangerous predator, someone whose crimes had escalated to the point where he was willing to do anything to fulfill his perversions. They claimed that he saw women as objects and got a thrill out of frightening them. According to the prosecution, from the second he saw Libby that night, alone, cold, upset and vulnerable, she simply became his target, his prey. They argued that he knew instantly what he was going to do the second she got into his car. They said that if it wasn't Libby, it would have been someone else, sober or intoxicated on that day or another. However, the defense was focused on the less than 10-minute window that he would have had to commit the crime. They argued that his car pulled into the fields at 12:11, and the screams were heard at 12:14, and then he was back out and driving by 12:20. It left a less than 10-minute window for all of this to happen, but the jury felt that this was more than enough time. After deliberating for 5 days, the jury found Pavel guilty on both counts of murder and the assault. He was jailed for life with a minimum term of 27 years. Upon sentencing him, the judge said that Libby did not stand a chance that night. They said that Pavel may never be released, and if he is, he will be monitored for the rest of his days. This case should never have been able to happen. It reveals an infuriating failure of the justice system, such a catastrophic failure that it triggered the loss of a beloved wife, daughter, friend and colleague. This is the case of Jill Marr. On the 30th of October 1982, Jill Marr, then Jill McKeon, was born in Drada, Ireland. Jill was a small-town girl growing up in Termonfeckin, a village with less than 1,600 people. When her father George got a job in Australia, she moved to Perth with her parents and her brother Michael. The new country wasn't a problem for Jill. She was a small-town girl with a big personality. She was really bright, bubbly and so gorgeous, said a school friend. She moved back to Ireland in 1996 to round off her education, graduating eventually from the University of Dublin with a Bachelor of Arts degree. Jill was going places. Anyone who knew her said so. Jill was always a life of the party, always had a smile on her face. She was always full of fun, always had something to say, and she was very intelligent. She met her husband Tom while at university, and the two relocated to Melbourne, Australia, Brunswick to be exact. Jill and Tom got a beautiful apartment on Lux Way. Life was going well. She became a unit coordinator for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, or ABC. There she was considered a rising star. Despite a small 5'1" frame, Jill's personality packed a huge punch. She had a great group of friends at work, and they often took to the town for a few drinks after they finished. The night of September the 21st, 2012 was no different. It was a Friday night. Jill had gone out with a few friends from ABC to the Brunswick Green Bar on Sydney Road. After staying there for a while, they moved on to Bar Etiquette, a short walk away. It was a good night. They let their hair down, drinks were flowing, and the group were in great spirits. As the night began to wind down, Jill decided to call it a night. She started walking back towards the flat on Lux Way that she shared with husband Tom at around 1:30 AM. This should have been a 12-minute walk at most. She called her brother Michael on the phone as she walked. It was only a short call. They spoke about their dad. They spoke about what they could get him for his upcoming birthday. Neither of them were aware that this would be the last time that they would speak. Back at the flat, Tom suddenly woke up to realize that he was still alone. His wife was not by his side. Jill hadn't arrived home yet. Checking the time, it was now 4 AM. And this just wasn't like Jill. Tom went out to search for his wife, but after checking everywhere he could think of and coming up short, he contacted the police. Jill was close to her family, and she was head over heels in love with her husband. She had great relationships with her friends. She wouldn't just stay out all night. Something wasn't right. As the news of her disappearance began to circulate, colleagues from ABC took to Twitter to get the news of her disappearance out. Friends, family and strangers began to put up posters around Brunswick. A Facebook page called Help Find Jill Maher was set up. Within just 5 days of the Facebook page being launched, it had received over 100,000 followers. On the 24th of September, a discovery was made. It was Jill's bag. It was found on Hope Street, just 7 minutes away from her home. After this discovery, the police weren't so sure that they were simply looking for a missing person anymore. To everyone's dismay, the case was handed over to homicide detectives. The very next day, officers had yet another breakthrough. An employee of the Duchess Boutique, a bridal store on Sydney Road, the same road where Jill and her friends had been that night, handed in some CCTV footage. The footage was less than ideal, largely obscured. It was filmed from inside of the shop, but it was still clear enough to change the course of the investigation in one fell swoop. In the footage, a man in a blue hoodie could be seen walking around suspiciously outside of the shop. The man could be identified as Caucasian. He looked like he was up to no good. 4 minutes later, the same man was back, but this time with Jill. She can be seen talking to him and showing him something on her mobile phone. This was the last known sighting of Jill Maher. With her phone clearly in her hand, police traced its movements that evening. In the footage, Jill is just a stone's throw away from her home, around 7 minutes. When the police tracked the phone's movement, triangulation shows her phone moving at speed down the freeway. So how does she get from a 7-minute walk away from her flat to being in a car hurtling down the freeway? Police used ANPR cameras to track down cars that were on the freeway at that time. Police then came to a horrifying discovery. They narrowed the cars down to just one that matched the triangulation of the phone, a car registered to a well-known and dangerous offender. 6 days after Jill Maher vanished, the police made an arrest. On the 27th of September, Adrian Ernest Bailey, age 41, was arrested at his home in Coburg for the intimate violation and ending of Jill Maher. He was taken into custody where he underwent hours of interviews and interrogation.
Around 2:30 this afternoon, police arrested a 41-year-old man in the suburb of Coburg. Now that suburb is near the suburb of Brunswick. Now he was taken here to the St Kilda Police Complex, has been questioned all afternoon and all evening. He hasn't yet been charged with any offence, but the expectation is that he will be charged over the disappearance of Jill Maher.
To the officer's surprise, Bailey confessed to everything. He recalled how he throttled Jill with his bare hands after violating her in a lane just off of Hope Street. 8 hours later at 10 p.m, he led officers to where her body had been left in a shallow grave on Black Hill Road. She was just weeks away from her 30th birthday. An amazing life cut tragically short.
The search for Jill Maher has come to a tragic end, with her body found in a shallow grave here in Gisborne South, about a 40-minute drive from where she was last seen in Sydney Road, Brunswick. She was buried several metres off a dirt road under a tall leafy tree. Homicide detectives and forensic police have spent several hours examining the scene. It's a very remote area surrounded by paddocks and only accessible by dirt road.
There was another horrifying discovery. Ernest Bailey was on parole when he ended Jill's life. Shockingly, following his arrest, Ernest's solicitor requested a suppression order be in place. This was to ban the publishing of any potentially damaging material about him. The request was granted. The horrifying reasons for the suppression order became quickly apparent. Jill was not Adrian Bailey's first victim. His known crimes date back to 1990, when an 18-year-old Bailey violated a friend of his sister. Just 1 month later, he struck again, attempting to do the same to a girl 1 year younger than himself. 4 months later, he attempted to do it again to another girl he picked up hitchhiking. He was charged and sent to prison in 1991 for these offences, serving just 22 months of a 5-year sentence. He would later admit that he had cheated the system system, simply going through the motions of rehabilitation. This man did not want to change. Officially, everyone believed he was no longer a danger to society, but he knew otherwise. And he admitted during a court appearance to forcing himself on another 5 women over a 6-month period in 2001. For this, he was jailed once more for 11 years, but again, he served just 8 years of this sentence before being released in 2010. Clearly, he was a man set in his ways. When being interviewed following his crimes against Jill, he said, "I should be in jail anyway, you know? I shouldn't have been let out last time, simple. And I say that in the hope someone hears that and they don't ever let me out again. How many chances does a person need?" Shockingly, they really were his own words. At 2 a.m. on the 28th of September, Bailey was charged. An hour later, he had an out-of-session hearing that lasted for just 90 seconds. This time, there would be no bail. He was held on remand to await his trial. The gravity of the situation must have been weighing on Bailey. He tried to end his own life whilst in custody. There were still questions that Jill's husband, family and community needed to know. Why Jill? Why that night? Why did he carry out these actions in such a savage manner? He told a psychologist, Professor James Ogloff, that he had attempted to kiss and touch Jill outside of the Brunswick Lane bar. She didn't react the way that he wanted her to, or the way that he expected. Jill stepped back and slapped him across the face. But Bailey wasn't used to being told no. Her response had made his blood boil. He was now enraged. He saw red after she had rejected his advances. He dragged her into a nearby lane and forced himself on her. However, Jill was a fighter, and she knew she was just 400 meters from home. After the assault, she hit him with her mobile phone and threatened to call the police. Bailey, however, responded by throttling her until no longer breathing. He was in too deep and panicking. He drove home, collected a shovel, and then returned to the scene of the crime. He dragged her into his car and drove to Ginzburn South. Here, he dug a shallow grave and attempted to bury her. When the news broke about everything that had happened to Jill Maher, the community was devastated. Shortly after the body was found, the Australian flag at the ABC South Bank studios was flown at half-mast as a sign of respect. Part of a statement on the ABC website read, Jill was a much-loved member of the local radio family. She was witty, intelligent, and great company. Jill was an innocent victim, a young, vibrant woman with her whole life in front of her. There were visuals, marches, and thousands of bouquets of flowers. They were left both to offer condolences and to try and promote changes for a safer community. But the reaction wasn't all positive. After Bailey had been charged, various Facebook users began to create pages about the case. As some of them were openly hostile towards Bailey, the Victoria Police tried to unsuccessfully have them taken down. This was to prevent any potential jurors being impacted or swayed by social media coverage. Jill's husband Tom also backed these calls to have them removed. Chief Commander Ken Lay condemned Facebook for not taking down the posts, saying, "When you see the hatred that's incited on some of these sites, it is very much the antithesis of what we saw yesterday with 30,000 people taking to the streets, saying, let's try and make this a safer and fairer community." On the 5th of April 2013, Bailey pleaded guilty. During a pre-sentence hearing, victim impact statements were read out. The devastation was immeasurable. Her widower Tom said, "What was stolen from us on September the 22nd, 2012 was love, my best friend and my entire world. I think of the waste of a beautiful mind and a brilliant soul. I am half a person because of this crime." During this hearing, Bailey's lawyer said that he understood he deserved a life sentence and that he was remorseful. Prosecutors hit back, arguing that as he attempted to conceal the crime, this proved that he wasn't sorry for his actions. If he was sorry, would he have gone through the troubles of knowingly digging a shallow grave? During this hearing, the suppression order was also lifted, allowing for his extensive history of violence to be revealed. The courtroom at the Victoria Supreme Court was packed out. The public gallery was full. The media was in a full frenzy. Bailey's lawyer had tried to argue that Bailey had borderline personality disorder, that he was an alcoholic who had been intimately violated as a youth. But the judge was having none of it. When sentencing him, Justice Nettle said that Adrian Bailey was a deviant, and that he either ended Jill because she threatened to call the police after he assaulted her, or because the idea of snuffing her out was arousing. I quote, "You were larger and stronger than she, and you used that physical advantage to dominate her. In effect, you dragged her off the street late at night, while she was peacefully going about her business within a stone's throw of her home." Throughout his sentencing, Bailey stared down at the floor, only looking up once his sentence was handed down. For someone that was remorseful, he wasn't great at showing it. On the 19th of June 2013, Adrian Ernest Bailey was sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 35 years. Following this high-profile case, Victoria's parole system underwent a massive overhaul. This was directly as a result of what happened to Jill. Dennis Napthine, Victoria's premier, explained, "There is no doubt that the system failed Jill Maher. Under the changes we've already introduced, the offender would have been back in jail, not on the streets. Our actions are the minimum we can do to try and make sure this never happens again." Do you think the punishment fits the crime here? What do you think could be done to avoid something like this happening again? Be careful out there, and I'll see you soon.